Chronicles of the Galactic Resistance, Siege of the Void. Chapter 1. The Resistance rises. The sky was dark, but the streets were alive with scattered survivors, wandering aimlessly in the ruined city. The hum of alien ships could still be heard in the distance, a constant reminder of the threat that loomed over them all. A small group moved through the rubble and debris. They were dressed in tattered clothing, but their eyes burned with a fierce determination. They were the Resistance, the last hope for humanity. Jared, the leader of the group, was a tall and imposing figure, his stern face set in a permanent scowl. He had lost everything to the alien invasion, but he refused to let despair overtake him. "Keep moving," he growled, casting a wary glance over his shoulder. "They're close." The others quickened their pace, knowing that they couldn't afford to be caught by the invaders. Suddenly, a blinding light filled the sky. Jared threw himself to the ground, shielding his eyes from the brightness. When he looked up, he saw a massive spacecraft hovering above them, its guns trained on their position. "Run!" he shouted, jumping to his feet and sprinting towards an abandoned building. The group followed him, their lungs burning as they gasped for air. They could hear the sound of the spacecraft's engines growing louder, and they knew that time was running out. Jared kicked open the door of the building, and they all rushed inside. The structure was mostly intact, but it was clear that it had been abandoned for some time. "Stay quiet," he whispered, his voice barely above a murmur. "We don't want them to find us." They huddled together, listening as the sound of the spacecraft drew closer. It sounded like it was right on top of them, and they could feel the whole building shaking. For a moment, they all held their breath, waiting for the ship to unleash its fury. But the sound of the engines began to fade, and they realized that they had made it through unscathed. "We made it," Jared breathed, a small smile creeping across his face. "Let's keep moving." The group emerged back onto the street, their spirits lifted by their narrow escape. They knew that the aliens would come after them soon enough, but for now, they were still alive, and that was all that mattered. As they hurried through the city, they came across other small bands of survivors. Jared stopped to speak to them, his deep voice ringing out through the chaos. "We have to fight back," he said, his eyes blazing with conviction. "We can't just sit here and wait for them to destroy us. We have to take the fight to them." He didn't know if anyone would listen to him, but he knew that he couldn't give up hope. The Resistance was just beginning, and they would do whatever it took to save humanity from the clutches of their alien oppressors. Chapter 2. The Empire Strikes Back. The Resistance had been on the move for days, constantly seeking shelter and avoiding detection from the alien invaders. They were running low on supplies and morale was beginning to dwindle. But Jared refused to give up. He knew that they had to keep pushing forward, no matter how bleak their situation seemed. It was just before dawn when they heard a deafening explosion in the distance. Jared's heart sank as he realized that it was coming from the direction they had been heading. "We have to go back," he said firmly, his eyes locking with those of his comrades. "They need our help." Without hesitation, they turned around and headed towards the source of the sound. As they approached, they could see a massive plume of smoke rising into the sky. There was no doubt that something had gone horribly wrong. When they arrived, they found a group of survivors huddled in the ruins of a small building. They were all injured, and their supplies had been completely destroyed in the blast. Jared knelt down beside them, his face a mask of concern. "What happened?" he asked, his voice gentle. One of the survivors, a young woman with a bandaged leg, spoke up. "The aliens," she said weakly. "They came out of nowhere. They must have known we were here." Jared gritted his teeth in anger. He knew that the aliens were always one step ahead of them, and it was only a matter of time before they were hunted down as well. "We have to keep moving," he said firmly. "We can't stay here." But before they could even begin to think about leaving, they heard the unmistakable sound of alien ships descending from the sky. Jared gestured for everyone to huddle together, bracing for impact. The ships were unlike anything they had ever seen before. They were sleek and black, with ominous red lights pulsing along their sides. They hovered ominously in the air, almost daring the Resistance to make a move. Jared could feel the fear rising in his chest, but he refused to give in. He stood tall, his eyes fixed on the ships above them. "Fire!" he shouted, and the Resistance sprang into action. They had very little in the way of weapons, but they were resourceful. They launched makeshift bombs at the ships, hoping to bring them down. But it was no use. The ships were too advanced, too powerful. As the ships descended, their guns blazing, Jared realized that they were hopelessly outmatched. But even in the face of certain death, he refused to give up. "We'll fight until our last breath," he growled, drawing his sword. "We'll go down fighting." The Resistance charged towards the ships, their weapons at the ready. For a moment, it seemed like they might actually stand a chance. But then the aliens fired on them, and everything went black. When Jared opened his eyes, he was lying on the ground. His ears were ringing, and his body was racked with pain. He could see the ruins of the city around him, but everything was blurry. Slowly, his vision cleared, and he saw that the aliens had won. The Resistance had been defeated. Tears filled his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. He had failed, but he would keep fighting. The Resistance would rise again, no matter how many times it was struck down. Chapter 3. The Void. Jared woke up to find himself in a strange place. It was dark and silent, and there was a dull ache in his head. He tried to move, but he found that he was bound tightly to a chair. "Where am I?" he muttered, his voice cracking. There was no answer, and for a moment, he feared that he was alone. But then a figure emerged from the shadows, their face obscured by a dark hood. "You are in our custody," the figure said, their voice cold and mechanical. "You are a threat to the Empire." Jared snorted in disbelief. "The Empire? Is that what you call yourself?" The figure didn't respond, but Jared could feel their eyes fixated on him. "What do you want from me?" he demanded. "We want information," the figure said simply. "About your Resistance." Jared gritted his teeth. He knew that he couldn't reveal anything to these aliens. But he also knew that they would stop at nothing to extract the information they wanted. "You won't get anything from me," he spat. The figure seemed unbothered. They walked over to a nearby console and began to type furiously. Jared could hear the sound of computer keys clicking, and he braced himself for whatever came next. And then there was nothing. The room was utterly silent, and Jared felt a growing sense of unease. He had heard horror stories of the aliens' torture methods, and he prayed that he wouldn't have to endure any of them. But then something strange began to happen. The walls of the room began to melt away, and Jared was plunged into a seemingly endless void. He felt weightless, as if he was floating in space. He couldn't see anything, but he could feel a presence around him. It was cold and malevolent, and it seemed to be probing his mind. Memories flooded through Jared's mind. He saw the faces of his fallen comrades, heard the screams of the dying. He saw his family, killed in the initial invasion. The pain was overwhelming, almost unbearable. He tried to resist, tried to push the memories away, but it was no use. The presence was too powerful. It pulled at him, teased at him, until he felt like he was on the brink of insanity. And then, suddenly, it was over. The room reformed around him, and the figure was standing in front of him once more. "Our scans indicate that you are no longer lying," the figure said, their tone devoid of emotion. "You do not have the information we seek." Jared gasped for air, his heart pounding in his chest. He had never experienced anything like that before, and he prayed that he would never have to go through it again. The figure turned to leave, but before they vanished into the shadows, they spoke once more. "But do not forget this. We will be watching you." Chapter 4. A desperate plan. Jared's encounter with the aliens left him shaken, but it also gave him a newfound sense of determination. He knew that they were going to keep coming after the resistance, and he had to be ready for them. He gathered his remaining comrades together and explained what had happened to him. They were all horrified, but they knew that they couldn't give up. "We have to strike back," Jared said firmly. "We can't keep running forever." The group fell into a thoughtful silence. They knew that Jared was right, but they had very little in the way of resources. "What if we could steal one of their ships?" one of the survivors suggested tentatively. Jared's eyes lit up. It was a crazy plan, but it just might work. It took several days of reconnaissance and planning, but the group eventually found an abandoned outpost on the outskirts of the city. It was guarded by a small group of aliens, but they were able to take them out without raising the alarm. They made their way inside the outpost, keeping to the shadows. The technology inside was unlike anything they had ever seen before, and they had no idea how to operate it. "We need to find someone who can help us," Jared said, his eyes scanning the room. And then they heard it. A low humming noise, coming from further inside the outpost. They crept towards the source of the sound, their fingers gripping their weapons tightly. And then they saw it. A sleek, black spacecraft, its engines humming softly. It was a thing of beauty, but they knew that it belonged to their enemies. Jared and his comrades approached the ship, their hearts pounding in their chests. They had no idea how they were going to steal it, but they knew that they had to try. As they began to examine the ship, they heard the sound of footsteps approaching. They turned, ready to fight, but then they saw him. A tall, lanky figure with wild hair and a manic grin. He was human, but he was dressed in the uniform of the aliens. "My name is Zane," he said, his voice cracking with excitement. "And I can help you steal this ship." Jared was suspicious, but he knew that they needed all the help they could get. They joined forces with Zane, who showed them how to operate the ship's controls. It was a crash course, but they picked it up quickly. They emerged from the outpost, their stolen ship cutting through the air like a knife. They knew that they had only a small window before the aliens caught on to what had happened. They had to get out of there, and fast. They flew the ship towards the edge of the city, their hearts racing with adrenaline. They could hear the sound of alarms blaring in the distance, and they knew that they had to move quickly. As they passed over the ruins of the city, they saw the aliens firing at them from the ground. But they were out of range now, and they knew that they had won this round. Jared glanced back at his comrades, his eyes bright with a fierce determination. "We may have lost a lot," he said, "but we're not done fighting yet." Chapter 5. The Showdown. Jared and his comrades flew their stolen ship to a hidden location, deep in the mountains. They knew that they had to keep moving, keep staying one step ahead of the aliens. But they also knew that they had to come up with a plan. They couldn't keep running forever. They had to take the fight to the aliens. Jared and Zane spent hours huddled over a map, trying to plot their next move. They knew that the aliens were holed up in a massive mothership, hovering above the city. They had to get inside. They decided on a risky plan. They would fly the stolen ship as close to the mothership as they could, and then they would use powerful explosives to breach its defenses. They would then storm the ship, taking out as many of the aliens as they could. It was a long shot, but they knew that they had to try. They might not survive, but if they succeeded, they could turn the tide of the war. The plan was set in motion. They flew the stolen ship towards the mothership, their hearts pounding in their chests. They could feel the ship's defenses firing on them, but they kept going. And then they hit it. The explosives went off with a deafening boom, and the ship shook violently. They rushed out of the ship, their weapons at the ready. They could hear the sound of alien weapons blazing, but they charged forward, their eyes fixed on their goal. They fought valiantly, taking out as many aliens as they could. Every step was a struggle, every moment filled with danger. But they pressed on, knowing that they had to succeed. And then Jared saw him. The leader of the aliens, standing in the center of the ship. He was tall and imposing, his eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. Jared charged towards him, his sword raised high. The leader didn't flinch, merely raising his own weapon to meet Jared's. The two of them clashed, their swords ringing out in the silent chamber. Jared gritted his teeth, pouring all of his strength into every swing. But he could feel himself tiring. He was outnumbered and outmatched, and he knew that he only had one chance. With a fierce cry, he lunged forward, piercing the leader's chest with his sword. The leader let out a gurgling scream, collapsing to the ground. Jared stood over him, his chest heaving. He could see the other aliens starting to back away, unsure of what to do. And then he heard a voice. A human voice, coming from behind him. "Jared," Zane said, his tone urgent. "We have to get out of here. The ship is going to explode." Jared glanced around, seeing the flashing lights indicating imminent danger. They fought their way out of the ship, diving into their stolen craft and blasting off into the sky. They could feel the heat of the explosion behind them, but they didn't look back. They had won. The aliens were defeated, and the resistance had triumphed. As they flew into the sunrise, Jared knew that their work was far from over. There would always be another threat, another challenge. But for now, they had earned their victory. Chapter 6. The aftermath. The city lay in ruins, its once thriving streets now reduced to rubble. The aftermath of the battle between the resistance and the alien invaders was evident everywhere. Jared and his comrades stood on a hill overlooking the wreckage, their eyes fixed on the scene below. They had won, but at what cost? They had lost so many comrades along the way. They had endured hardships that no one should ever have to face. But they had kept going, pushing through the pain and the suffering, because they knew that the fate of humanity rested on their shoulders. Jared turned to his remaining comrades, his face etched with determination. "We can't let their sacrifice go to waste," he said. "We have to rebuild, to make this city and this world a better place than it was before." His comrades nodded, their eyes shining with hope. It was a long road, but they were up to the challenge. They worked tirelessly, day and night, to clear away the debris and start anew. They formed a government, the likes of which the world had never seen before, and they worked to provide aid and support to those who had lost everything. As word of their efforts spread, people from all over flocked to the city, eager to help in any way they could. They worked side by side with the resistance, rebuilding homes, planting gardens, and creating a community that was stronger than ever before. It wasn't easy, of course. There were still those who opposed them, who wanted to see them fail. But the resistance was not easily deterred. They had been through too much, had sacrificed too much, to let a few naysayers get in their way. Years passed, and the city began to thrive once again. The aliens were nothing more than a distant memory now, a warning of what could happen if humanity let their guard down. The resistance became a beacon of hope, a symbol of what people could achieve when they banded together and refused to give up. Jared knew that their work was not done, of course. There would always be new challenges, new threats to overcome. But he was proud of what they had achieved, of the community they had built and the lives they had touched. As he stood in the heart of the city, surrounded by the sights and sounds of a vibrant metropolis, he knew that he had truly found his purpose. The past may have been fraught with danger and uncertainty, but the future was bright, filled with endless possibilities. The resistance had won, and they had changed the world for the better. And for Jared, that was all that mattered. Chapter 7. The New Era. Jared stood on the rooftop of the new resistance headquarters, looking out over the city below. It had been years since the aliens had invaded, and the world had changed in so many ways. The city was thriving, the people united in their determination to create a better world. The resistance had become a powerful force in the world, a beacon of hope for all those who dreamed of a brighter future. Jared smiled. his heart swelling with pride. He had been there from the beginning, through all of the hardships and the victories. He had seen the world transformed, and he knew that there was so much more that could be achieved. Suddenly, he heard a voice behind him. "Jared, my old friend," the voice said. "It's been a long time." Jared turned to see an old man standing behind him, his eyes filled with kindness and wisdom. It was one of the few survivors of the original resistance, a man who had been there with Jared from the beginning. "Uncle Sam," Jared said, tears filling his eyes. "I never thought I would see you again." Uncle Sam chuckled. "I couldn't stay away forever," he said. "I had to come back and see what you've all accomplished." Jared looked out over the city once again, his eyes taking in the sights and sounds of the bustling metropolis below. "We've accomplished so much," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "But there's still so much more to do. There's still so much injustice and suffering in the world." Uncle Sam nodded. "That's true," he said. "But look at what you've done. Look at the world you've created. You've shown that when people band together and work towards a common goal, anything is possible." Jared smiled, his heart filled with hope. He knew that the journey ahead would be long and difficult, but he also knew that he was not alone. He had his comrades, his friends, and the rest of the world to help him along the way. Together, they would continue to push towards a brighter future, one where people were free to live their lives without fear or oppression. They would work tirelessly, day and night, to create a world that was truly worthy of the goodness and potential of humanity. And as Jared looked out over the city once again, he knew that anything was possible. The new era had begun, and the people of the world were ready to embrace it with open hearts and minds.